and a lecture by Josh Seymour, who is a conservator working at the National Army Museum, predominantly working with industrial collections, vehicles, etc. He previously studied BA Modern History and Politics before competing for his Master of Science Conservation degree at Cardiff University. Previous work has been with smaller military museums and with the Imperial War Museum. So Josh is more than qualified to talk to us about looking after a few firearms. And I'll hand over to Josh.
Lovely, thank you, Derek. Right, I'll just set this up. Hopefully that's okay for you all. You can see my presentation. But yeah, just
yeah, very clear, Josh.
Yeah,
thank
all
you.
Good, lovely, thank you. So yeah, just adding to what Derek said, quick introduction of myself. So I'm Josh. I'm a conservator, so I'll go into a bit what conservation is and what my role is at the National Army Museum. But as Derek said, I've been in conservation now for like 6 years. After doing my training, I've worked at what's the Firing Line Museum, which is in Wales, in Cardiff Castle. I've worked at Remy Museum, and then Imperial War Museum, then Florence Nightingale Museum, which had a niche sort of Crimean War section, as you can imagine. And then recently, 2 years ago, I've started at the National Army Museum as a conservator. I've predominantly focused on military collections, as you can probably tell from the museums I have experience working in. And obviously, working with military collections, you're going to come across a firearm every now and then. I've sort of joined the National Army Museum at a period where we've been updating all the galleries. So we had what was called the gallery refresh, where all the galleries have basically been updated to meet visitor feedback. So as part of that, me and my colleague Philippa, who was supposed to be doing this with me, but she's on maternity leave. She's just had a child. We've been sort of assessing and preparing firearms for display, which is one aspect of our job, but I'll go through some other aspects as well to introduce you to what we do, introduce you to the firearm collection at our museum. As we say, there'll be time for questions at the end. If you have any queries about our collection, sort of more a curatorial question, some I'll be able to answer, but the more specific stuff would be for our firearms curator, who, if there's anything urgent, I can put you in touch with. But yeah, I'll get started. Apologies if I ramble on a lot, because I've been known to do that. So yeah, firearms conservation. So what we'll be covering today. So I spoke to Matthew and spoke about what topics might be interesting and useful for you guys. So what is conservation? Because it often gets mixed up with restoration. So people, if I explain my job, people think I'm restoring objects, but I'm conserving them. So there is a difference, which I'll go into. History of the National Army Museum and its firearm collection. And then we'll look at some of our jobs that me and Philippa are responsible for with the rest of the wider team, which are storing museum firearms, how we make our condition assessments, how we treat objects if they require intervention to get them suitable for display, and sort of when we should treat something and when we shouldn't treat something is a question we've got to debate quite often. How we display our firearms in the museum, which I'm sure, being enthusiasts, you've gone to look at lots of firearm displays. And then an interesting aspect which often gets brought up are hazards in the firearm collection as well. There's different materials which we have to consider both in terms of displaying, but as I'm getting hands-on and looking at the firearms, I've got to think about my own health in the workspace as well. So, as I say, I'm a conservator. So what is conservation and how is it different to restoration? So conservation is the preservation, protection, care and restoration of our cultural heritage. And because the text is quite small there, so apologies, I'll read out the entire definition, but this is set by the Institute of Conservation, who are sort of the professional body in the United Kingdom. Like myself, we get memberships to this institution, and that's where we eventually become accredited conservators. So it's the professional body that manage and define definitions, that sort of thing. So preservation and conservation, all actions taken to retard deterioration or prevent damage to cultural property. It involves controlling the environment and conditions of use and may include treatment in order to maintain an object as nearly as possible in an unchanging state. In the case of archival material, moving image and sound, this may include transferring to another medium. Okay, so it's basically, as I'll show on the comparison with restoration, we're trying to stop an object from getting worse, from deteriorating. But a key with that is you can't necessarily stop an object from deteriorating. So part of that is slowing down the deterioration as much as possible, whether that's, as we say, intervening and treating it, or whether we just make a decision not to display an object because it's too fragile. In the case of archival material, like I said, moving image and sound, one way of preservation, as we probably know, is just digitization, getting them onto memory sticks, that type of thing, so that they can be preserved for a long time without actually having to get the original material out all the time. So conservation versus restoration then. So what is the aim of conservation? Building on that. So we're trying to preserve an object in its original form for as long as possible with minimum intervention. So it appreciates that an object has lived out a history. Every little scratch maybe is a story to tell. Restoration can be highly interventive and may look to return an object to an ideal state. So the way I always explain it, to give an example, is let's do it with a firearm, for example. A firearm has come out of the factory, gets given to a soldier, used in a battle. The soldier, knocks it about a bit, it gets scratched, damage to the wooden butt, all that type of thing. And then eventually it ends up in a museum. So in conservation, we say all that damage to the butt, all the dirt it might have picked up, every little scratch tells a story potentially of the object itself, but of those who handled the object, whether that's in the manufacturing of the object, because we have to understand manufacturing history, whether it's the soldier and their experiences with it. All those little tiny details which make the objects look disgusting or maybe dirty, they all have a story to tell. Restoration, the museum might receive that firearm and say, we want it to be factory new. So they'll do a lot of interventive work, maybe replace the butt to make it clean and smooth. And that's how I see restoration. It's almost putting an object to its ideal state, as if it's just fresh out of the factory, rather than appreciating that objects do get used, they do get knocked, they do get damaged. Like I say, this is something we have to debate quite often, not just with our firearm collection, but if we have a ceramic, for example, and it's got a chip in it, or a lot of the pictures missing from decorated ceramic, how was that damaged? Do we really want to sort of repaint what was there? Would that be restoration, or is that helping us understand the object a bit better? So sometimes we'll move towards restoration if the damage has been done unnecessarily, like say while it's been in the possession of the museum. But yeah, quite often we're looking to conserve rather than restore. I hope those definitions are clear, but yeah, I'd say it's returning it to its, trying to preserve its state, its current state, rather than return it to an ideal state in its past. Okay. Oops, what's happening there? So we also within our team, quick explanation of our team, and that helps us break into this interventive and preventative conservation. We at the National Army Museum, we have 4 conservators, and we've just got an assistant conservator to help us because 3 of my colleagues have all gone on maternity leave at the same time, which wasn't very helpful for me. So we've got an assistant in to help as well. But our team's broken into what you could call interventive, preventative, and then specialist conservation. So myself and my colleague Philippa, we are under the interventive branch of conservation, but what other museums might call 3D object conservators. So we look after firearms, vehicles, pots, pans, helmets, anything you might consider a 3D object, leather, metals, woods. So we're kind of almost a catch-all of all materials. So both me and Philip have had specialist training to deal with a range of materials within sort of this military context in particular. Our specialist colleague, she is a textile conservator, because as you can imagine at the National Army Museum, we do have a lot of textiles. We actually, it is claimed that we have the largest number of male working uniforms of any museum. So like male workwear, we've got the largest collection of, because of the context of the army being a professional job and the many centuries of uniforms we've got in our collection. So we have a specialist because the way you treat a jacket, a soft, delicate stitching, obviously that's going to be different to me scraping corrosion off a pot or something like that. Our fourth conservator then comes into this category of preventative. Ideally, you'd only ever use preventative conservation, and I'll explain why. But essentially, she's in charge of looking after the objects without intervening with them, and that's basically controlling the environment around them. So we have a four-person team currently, and we've got a nice balance of skills across the team to look after the collection the best we can. Other things such as art and paper, so they're where I said 3D objects, art, paper, and textiles do come under those 2D objects. So they're specialists. So the artwork and paper archival material, we tend to get sent out to contractors because we're not trained to do that. So that's why it's useful to have a textile conservator, because that's a branch we wouldn't normally touch upon. So interventive conservation. So it varies from surface cleaning and the smallest repair to full-blown replacement, or that word I said not to use, restoration. Okay, because as I say, sometimes we might have to restore something because a large part of a ceramic is missing, which is structurally important, and sometimes we repair objects so that further deterioration doesn't occur. But yeah, we treat anything such as surface cleaning as being interventive because we're hands-on, we're touching the object. Something as simple as dusting, there is a risk there that we're going to cause damage to the object because it might be fragile. There might be loose paint on the object that we take off. It might actually be that the dust is abrasive. So if you're cleaning it wrong and you're almost polishing it off, you might be scratching the surface, which could lead to corrosion in the long term for metals. So anything where you're hands-on with the object, we treat that as interventive. And I've got some examples of interventive conservation for our firearm collection further on in the slide, in the presentation, as it's something, like I said, me and Philippa have been working on the past couple of years. Preventive conservation then is indirect action to stop that deterioration, prevent damage. So this is all about creating optimal conditions. So preventive conservation can be anything from policy. So, for example, who gets to handle objects? Why do they get to handle objects? It might be storage. So how are we storing them in the museum? And the key ones for our preventive conservator. So it's the conditions we store in. So we monitor our temperature across our storage and gallery spaces. The key one is relative humidity. And it's about finding a good balance for these mixed collections because too dry is really good for metals, but not good for organic materials like wood because it can cause splitting and cracking. But yeah, too damp, again, might cause then corrosion of metals, and it also might promote mold on organic materials as well. So it's about finding those optimal conditions. Preventive conservation as well is monitoring for pests. So for our textiles, we monitor for clothes moths, as you can imagine. For our furniture, we're looking for like wood boring beetles, etc. So there's a range of preventive measures we have in place. Like I say, in an ideal world, we'd put an object in a box, it's in perfect conditions, and it will last forever. If we were to do that, however, there's not really any point in having a museum because we love history. We want to put new history on display. If everything was in a box, it's not really ideal. So the two pictures on the right, The top right was for an exhibition in Cambridge, actually. But the job was reducing tarnish of the silver, as you can see, but also stabilizing the lead shot at the back, and also that iron shot at the front as well. Everything essentially was corroding on that object. And then at the bottom, it's potentially a way we're packing an animal in that picture. I can't remember what it is. It's not in our collection. It's from a different collection, actually, that one of my colleagues did. But I didn't do anything. I did something quite similar the other week. I was packing what's called Crimean Tom, which is our cat from the Crimean War, allegedly. So it's packing objects suitably, stopping the way you pack them is acid free, in a box that's suitable, that limits the amount of moisture and temperature changes that might happen to that object, but also then a box which is then suitable to pick up and carry and move around without damaging the object, which is why you can see all the padding around that animal. Right. So these are the what are called the agents of decay. So the Canadian Conservation Institute came up with these. This government body in Canada, because they get a bit more funding over there from the government itself. And these are the 10 factors they deemed the most at causing trouble for our collections. These are what we have to think of when we're making assessments for our firearms as well. So if we're putting them on display, where we're storing them, how we're handling them, for example, they're issues. These are the issues we have to address. And I'll quickly run through how some of these might affect the firearms collection. So criminal activity. So as you can imagine, our firearms on display, not all of them are deactivated. So in terms of criminal activity, the firearms in the museum are probably those that have the highest level of security around them. So only certain people are allowed to access them. Only certain people are allowed to transport them. Only certain people are allowed to put them on display. When they're put on display, it has to be reinforced glass, as you can imagine. Criminal activity is just stopping people from getting their hands on the firearms unnecessarily. Disassociation is the one which probably needs the most explanation. So disassociation is you're kind of ruining the object's historical record by separating pieces. So an example I've been addressing of this with our firearm collection is sometime in the 90s, someone decided to take a lot of the working parts out of the firearms and almost leave them as hollow shells. So we have drawers and boxes full of springs and little nuts where it wasn't put on record where that springs come from. So that in a way is destroying our knowledge and our interpretation of that firearm, because we don't know what that spring's for. And we have a firearm in the collection missing a spring somewhere, for example. So that's disassociation. It's separating parts of an object, splitting them up and not documenting it correctly. Fire, self-explanatory, really, what the risks of fire. What we have to think about, though, which is quite interesting with fire, are what are the risks of our fire extinguishing system. So if we have water sprinklers, for example, it then leads into the next agent of decay. Not only will we have smoke damage, we might then have water damage on some of these objects as well. Pests, like we say, for our firearms, so water might be anything from leaks, or it might be, a flood, because we are by the River Thames, for example. If there was heavy flooding, which there shouldn't be, there's nothing to say we might get affected in our lower areas of the museum. Pests, so our main pests we're probably looking for in terms, well, a couple. So we have a lot of barrel jackets for some of our machine guns, for example. So they might get moth damage from moths laying their larvae on them. But also, again, the wood, we're looking at those wood-boring insects. So we have monitors around the firearms area where we can sort of measure pest activity to ensure it's not getting too high. So yeah, that's one of our risks. Contaminants. So contaminants, probably our key contaminant, which people don't often think of. The main one is dust. Dust can carry horrible acids or pollutants in it, which could affect metals. Also, the problem with dust is it's so dry, that might then bring in moisture from the surrounding environment, which can then promote corrosion as well. So contaminants, it's about monitoring, but also keeping your space tidy, vacuuming so we don't have a lot of dust every so often. Light. Light is an issue with our mainly organic materials. Essentially, the light damage is going to come from fading. The energy attacks sort of pigments over time. Two causes of light damage. One is UV light. So UV energy from light, but in our museum, we're only using LED light bulbs now, which have 0 UV, and all our windows are filtered, and then our glass cases have UV filter as well. So UV is not a problem for us, but long exposure to light can still cause fading. So what we have in place is we have a light engineer who we work with when we install objects, and we tell them largely for organics, we're looking at a measurement which is called 50 lux. And that keeps it nice and low and cool, and it's not enough energy to start causing fading unless it was then on display for 20 years with a permanent light shining on it. So we have measures to control that. Temperature. So again, we're kind of, as mentioned earlier, with temperature and humidity, which I'm going to come for, we're looking for almost like that Goldilocks. So what's the perfect temperature for our objects? Because we've got mixed materials, we aim for 18 to 22 degrees across the storage spaces and in the galleries. The key problem with temperature, though, isn't the actual temperature, it's how fast it changes. So you can think about if you have a high temperature and it shoots down quite fast to a low temperature and then high up again, that's going to cause something like wood on a stock, for example, to expand and then shrink, expand, shrink. And that's not going to be good for the overall structure of the wood and might lead to splitting and cracking. Humidity, as I said, we were looking to control that because anything too low, again, might dry out the organic material. And that could be, say, wooden structure of the firearm itself, but it also might be stuff like leather slings or textile slings that we might have on the firearms as well. But if we then make that too high, we're going to promote mold or corrosion on the barrel, etc. And then finally, physical force. You can imagine what that is. I might pick up a firearm and drop it, and it's going to cause damage. But it might also be sort of storing the firearm on its side and knocking off a loose cocking handle or something like that. So they're what we call our agents of decay. Again, they'll come up shortly when I'm looking at some of the examples to give you. So we have, what I'll quickly go into now is the history of the National Army Museum and the collection itself. So who are we? So National Army Museums are leading authority on the British Army and its impact on society past and present. So we examine the Army's role from the British Civil Wars to the modern day. Through our collections, we preserve and share stories of ordinary people with extraordinary responsibilities, and we explore the role of the Army and its relevance today. So in a nutshell, the history of the Army, we start with Cromwell's model army, and we go right up to what's happening today with the British Army training Ukrainians, for example, is one of the topics we cover. I'm just going to share a quick video with you. Hopefully it comes through. I think it was mentioned it was a little quiet earlier, so you may need to temporarily turn your volume up a bit, but it just covers the history of the museum, how it was founded, and then I'll go into our firearm collection after that.
The story of the Army reflects our nation's history. When the seeds of the National Army Museum were sown in the 1950s, the tide of empire was ebbing. Most of the Army's Irish regiments were long gone, disbanded in 1922 following the Irish War of Independence. And in 1947, Britain's withdrawal from the Indian subcontinent signalled the end of the British Indian Army. As the British officers of the old Indian Army were retired from service and returned home, they embarked on a new life. Their personal records, relics and paraphernalia of military service were boxed up, awaiting a new home. They found one at Sandhurst, a training academy for army officers since 1812. In 1951, after appeals for exhibits and donations, an Indian Army Memorial Room was formally opened at Sandhurst. Further rooms followed in 1954, showcasing objects from Irish and cavalry regiments, around which the collections continued to grow. Led by Field Marshal Sir Gerald Templar, efforts were made to organize the collections on a professional museum footing, a move coinciding with further changes to the Army and the ending of national service. As a result, the National Army Museum was founded by Royal Charter in 1960 and opened by the Queen later that year in Sandhurst's Old Riding School. Significant acquisitions included the original Victoria Cross, Napoleon's horse, and Captain Siburn's prodigious model of the Battle of Waterloo. As the new museum continued to expand, there was a growing desire to make its collections more accessible to the general public. In 1971, it moved to a purpose-built site on the grounds of the Royal Hospital Chelsea's old infirmary and was officially opened once again by the Queen. There, the museum cemented its reputation as the leading authority on the history of the Army, hosting important exhibitions on all aspects of the Army's past. In the 1980s, the need for more space saw a significant extension of the Chelsea building, and by the 21st century, its growing popularity resulted in exciting new plans. The museum closed for 3 years, undergoing a major transformation, and was opened by the Queen for a third time in 2017. Working with partners across the UK, the museum continues to tell the story of our Army and its importance to Britain and the wider world, the triumphs and disasters, and above all, the service of our soldiers. That story continues, and the National Army Museum will continue to tell it.
Great. I hope you was able to hear that. Essentially, in a nutshell, a lot of stuff got brought back from India when the British Indian Army disbanded. They started realizing they had some quite interesting things at Sandhurst, so then they started putting this collection together, which then turned into the National Army Museum. It showed some of our key objects in there. One of my favorites is Marengo, the skeleton of Napoleon's horse Marengo. And I had to put its skull back on, which is quite an interesting, not many people have done that in the past, type of lucky things that I've been able to do while I'm there. But essentially, I hope it explains, if you've not been to the museum, what we're about. We're about highlighting what life's like for a soldier, the major campaigns in British military history, but also stuff just such as how the British Army operates at home in sort of stuff like Trooping of the Colour, etc. So you can imagine with that, if we're documenting the story of our army, as we say, and the soldiers who fought in it and those who trained in it, we're going to have a firearms collection. So when you look under our firearms category at the museum, you get over 2,000 results when you put that into our database. So it ranges from muskets, rifles, pistols, and then under our firearms, we then get some of the heaviest stuff like grenade launchers, rocket launchers, and machine guns. We don't have quite as extensive a collection as they do up at the Royal Armouries in Leeds, because they purposely try and collect basically every firearm there has been in history from all different countries. We largely focus in our collection, obviously, those used by the British Army. However, we do have firearms from allies or combatants, sometimes with unique stories behind them. Largely combatants are where they've been seized as trophies. But what we also collect are those firearms which are important to understanding the advancement of firearms through the period. So we don't have an extensive collection as Royal Armouries, but as you can imagine, as we go back to the founding of the Army, we have muskets, which obviously the Imperial War Museum don't have as well, as they start in 1914, their collection. So we do have a nice wide range of objects within the firearms collection, as we say. The way we get them, because we often get asked how we get our firearms, we get them from MOD transfers. So we recently took on board a range of SA80 variants that the MOD were getting rid of. So they sometimes offer us saying, we're going to get rid of these. Would you like them? And if we don't have one, yeah, we take it. We ask for it. Amnesty as well. So, for example, I believe the military police a few years back gave us an MG34, which someone shouldn't have had. So we got that as a gift from them because we wanted one, but also purchases. So more for the, as you probably do yourselves, looking at auction sites, firearms might come up, antique firearms, and we'll apply for them. And if we get the funding, we'll get them. So in terms of the firearms team, as I said, we used to have a weapons conservator who had a bit more of a background in being an armourer than me, and that was about 20 years ago. They used to have very specific jobs in terms of looking after the collection, like an armourer, etc. But now it's just all come under a conservation category. And kind of that is reflecting the profession, how it's some of these places are moving towards museum professionals rather than sort of those with military backgrounds and that type of thing. But part of that is also thinking about what we would want as a working collection, and what we understand as being our object collection. So basically our evolution is what we try and do is these firearms are objects just as much as anything else is in the collection. So we don't necessarily treat them as firearms. Rule number one is they are objects. Okay, so any rule that applies to a jacket, a helmet, a radio, those rules apply to the firearms, but then there's some more specific rules to acknowledge it is a firearm, of course, to do with safety and security. As I said, some of the firearms have been deactivated in the past. Some have sort of been officially deactivated by, say, BSA. Some have just been deactivated by our armourer, and that was what I was on about. We have boxes full of springs and loose bits which were gutted out of the firearms. But it's not a general rule. So we do still have a lot of active firearms, right up to the modern day stuff. So I'll go into some of the aspects we think about in our job, looking after the collection. As I say, if you do have any questions about the firearms collection, what we might have, you can search online on our website. Our collection database will bring up some results. But we do have an inquiries team at the museum as well, who you can post questions to, and they'll get back to you. So storing of museum firearms. So we have our firearms stores, and these are some of the ways we store our firearms. As we say, we've got hundreds, near thousands of firearms. We need a convenient way to store them because we have to think about their security, but also, as we said, thinking about their stuff like physical damage to them, pollutants reaching them, temperature, humidity, that type of thing. So they're in our firearms store, and it's a climate controlled room. So we, like I say, because it's mixed materials, we just have to settle for a Goldilocks 18 to 22 degrees is what we start trying to store them at. Obviously, it gets below that and above that, but like I said, it's about those rapid changes are our problem. And then the temperature we monitor, the humidity we monitor, and roughly we want that to be between 45 and 55 percentage RH. So these are the ways we store them. So as you can see on the left, these are roller racks. So this picture's a bit old, but they have wheels on the front of them now. And essentially, kind of like what you get in libraries. If we want to get to the fifth one, we just spin the wheel, it moves them all along, and then we can get in there. So these have been arranged so that the oldest are at one end, and then we work through, and then we have a rack full of, say, Second World War, the Enfields, and so on. So they're well organized so that we can keep track of them, think about what gaps we might have to fill in a physical sense as well. But yeah, it obviously makes sense to keep some sort of order with them. So we have roller racking. What we have in the middle, so for our smaller firearms, so you can see some pistols there, we use what are called plastozote cutouts. So plastozote, it's a foam and it's inert, and it's used in museums and conservation because it doesn't react with anything and it's soft. You can get different grades of it and different thicknesses. So what they've done here, they've done a plastozote base, and then we've cut out the shape of the firearm so that it sits in. Because they're in drawers, as you can imagine, if someone knocks a drawer and shuts it, we don't want all the firearms colliding into one another. So that holds them in place while we're opening them and closing them. What these actually do then is you can pick up an entire layer of the pistols, and then there's another layer underneath with our drawers. So it's smart storage, but it's keeping them safe. It's stopping the firearms from interacting with one another as well. And then, as you can see on the right, we have our heavy duty racking as well. This is probably the least ideal. One, it's a bit more exposed to the environment in the area. Obviously, if we close a drawer with the pistols, you know, they're fairly free from dust and you don't get those same humidity changes that you might have. But unfortunately, sometimes you just have to be practical. We have these really big Brownings on there and rocket launchers, which would be too heavy for us to put on the roller racking, for example. So sometimes, yeah, we just have to be practical and think about how we're going to store these things. Like I say, there's ideal conditions for everything. Like we say, it'd be great if we could put every one of these in their own individual box in a nice environmentally controlled drawer, but there's costs to think about and there's practicalities. So you can't always have the perfect setup. Storage and packing materials then. So we'll store objects like this if we're moving them to a gallery, if they're being transported somewhere, or if they're being moved for research, or if they're deemed too fragile for any of those other storage solutions, we'll put them in a box. So our sort of recommended technique is we'd largely have a box which is a suitable size, and then you can see in the picture, that's acid-free tissue, and we call them tissue puffs. You don't scrunch it up and you don't fold it flat. There's a special way of folding it so that it almost makes like an airbag. So you can press on it, but as soon as you release it, it takes its form, its normal, regular form. So we have to use acid-free tissue paper and free cards because the acid, if there's acid in the tissue, it can leach out onto the object and cause damage. We might use stuff like polyester film. So a brand we use is Melanex, which is an inert plastic film. And then we might use inert foams, as I mentioned, Plastazote, and another one is Jiffy, and then unbleached, undyed calico. Sometimes we might wrap the barrel in something like a calico but we'll try and avoid doing that because it might be that if you put a textile on it, it gets caught on the wood and causes splinters and for it to crack, etc. Tyvek is another one. So Tyvek, the white, what you use for hazmat suits, for example. So that's a moisture resistant material. So if we have something we believe is susceptible to moisture, for example, we might put it in a Tyvek bag and it will stop pollutants and moisture reaching the object. And then, yeah, another one we have is Corex, which is a plastic packing material that we'll use as well. Short-term packing, and these are the dangerous ones that people think are acceptable, but in the long term, they're not. So bubble wrap, the gas in bubble wrap is absolutely awful. And as it seeps out of the plastic, it can attack objects. We had to have a painting conserved because it had been wrapped in bubble wrap in the past. And when the bubble wrap was taken off, there was all these little circles where the gas had come out and attacked it. So it largely attacks organics, but if it's acidic enough, it might attack the metal as well. So bubble wrap, like I said, short term, if we're using it just to transport a firearm, fine. Long-term storage, even medium-term storage, I would not recommend bubble wrap. That's the same with poly bags. You can get poly bags which are conservation grade, but your general freezer bags, etc., which you might get from the supermarket, they're going to degrade over time. Again, might release acidic gases which attack the object. And then polystyrene as well. Polystyrene, the main one we're after, are sort of packing peanuts, which you might have used. Again, they release horrible gases which can attack woods, and if they're acidic enough, they'll attack the metals as well. Historic packaging is something we have to think about as well. So I mentioned earlier about disassociation. If we separate one part of an object from another part of the object and it's not recorded well, that information might get lost. So take the pistol in the center, for example. If I took that out of the box and separated the two, I put the pistol in one of our pistol drawers and then the box in a separate location. If I don't record that properly, that information might get lost, and then we never know. We might just think we have an empty box where we didn't receive the pistol for it. The problem with this, however, so you can see that pistol in the middle, it's felt lined and although there was a craze of using it in museums at one point, that again can release really nasty gases that can attack objects. What we do in that situation is what the material I mentioned on the previous page, Melanex, so an inert plastic film, we'd cut that out and actually put it in the box so it acts as a barrier layer. So the firearm isn't touching that material. That's the same with the box on the right, because that's got a foam. And a lot of these foams, especially funded by like the MOD, etc., it's not the primary purpose of that firearm. So the foam might be made quite cheaply and over time degrade, release horrible gases, or even physically interact with the contact points with the firearm itself. But again, we can try and limit that by creating a barrier layer. But the problem with that is, like I said, the gases, the plastic isn't going to stop the gas. So it's something we have to weigh up, whether we separate these or whether we keep them together and monitor them in the long term for any signs of decay. Another we have then on the left, packaging such as like leather holsters or leather bags. Not very clear in the picture there, apologies. Well, it might be on your side screen, not on mine, but you can see the copper button has what's called bronze disease, which is basically the copper corrosion, the blue. You can't see it too well, but some of that bronze disease has actually got onto the pistol grip, onto the plastic there, the Bakelite. So again, what should have been done in the long term, in the past, they should have been separated so that even if it does corrode, it shouldn't get onto the object as it has, because it's now stained it, and that will require, like we said, what we don't want to be doing, but sometimes have to, that will require interventive treatment to get that off. This probably happened a long time ago, because we don't have the conditions in our storage for that much bronze disease to take place now. But it can be sort of, once it starts, it's hard to stop unless, again, you're intervening and scraping it off and then cleaning the surface of the metal. So these are some packaging issues we have to think about in terms of storage. Condition assessment. So condition assessment is what it says on the tin. We have one of our firearms, and we'll complete condition assessments if a firearm's going on display or if it's new to the museum. So we try and catch these early now. It used to be that a firearm get brought in, the curator would catalogue it, and it gets put on the shelves or the racks for ages. And we don't think about its condition until we want to use it. What we try and do is get a condition assessment so that if a curator does want to use it in the future, that condition assessment's already there and they can see how suitable it is to use, for example. So these are the different problems we're looking at when we're thinking about our firearms. These are probably, again, issues you might have with your collection and things you think about. We might just have a bit more of a museum approach to how we deal with them. So corrosion of metals, for example, particularly the ferrous components, but encompassing most metals. So with this, for example, self-explanatory. It's related to the environment, and what we'd look to do is stabilize it. So if, for example, we're putting a firearm on display and there's what we consider to be active corrosion, we'd look to remove that top corrosion, which is the active most, and then start a rinsing cycle of the corrosion beneath to get rid of chlorides that might be causing that corrosion. We wouldn't necessarily sand it so far down that it's now back to a smooth metal again, because, again, if we have a Lee Enfield and it's been to the trenches, it's probably going to have got some corrosion. It's about stabilizing that corrosion rather than removing it, because that's part of its history. So we'll stabilize it. Like I said, we'll get rid of the top layer, rinse the bottom layer of corrosion, and then we'll maybe apply a wax to stop oxygen from reaching it and causing further corrosion if we've not potentially got all the chlorides out. Splitting cracked or warped stocks. So often happens around the wrist or neck of the stock on the underside of the forestock. So this is something we have to consider before we even fully pick up the firearm as well, because we've got a fragile firearm. say the one in the picture. If I go to pick that up and the stock's only loosely attached, it's going to snap as I pick it up. So we'll do an initial assessment before we even handle them and move them to a table to make a full assessment. Oil and grease as well. Obviously, to make sure all your working parts are working and able to function, oil and is applied, or grease is applied in the past historically. Again, this is part of the working object, so it is part of the object's history. What we have to balance, though, is potentially excess oil. And it might be that some of that excess oil is dripped down onto a wooden component. As it oxidizes over time, it then becomes acidic, which then might eat into the wood, or it might cause corrosion elsewhere. So we might think about we'd try to avoid fully stripping the oil, but we'll definitely get rid of excess oil. A problem with oil sometimes, though, is it might pick up dust over time. So in certain cases, we will remove all of the oil or grease to make sure there's nothing acidic left behind, which might then cause damage to the object in the long term. Like we said, insect damage in stocks, you might have something that's disguising internal damage, like a veneer, but there might be insect damage. It's been disguised by something like conservation treatment. This might be, that there was insect attack in the past and someone's treated it, maybe by waxing it or something. So that damage is hidden and it's got worse over time, for example. So we're looking for insect damage. Just change page. Oh yeah, you can see there on the bottom, that's sort of excess oil that's going a bit acidic, it's going dark, and it's caused corrosion around certain parts of the object. Old residues and oils which are applied for well-meaning preservation as well. So ironically, a lot of what conservation is replacing previous conservators' work, because sometimes the research wasn't there to say why we shouldn't do something. But yeah, so quite often we get new techniques come through our journals and papers from research, and we find that old techniques sometimes might not be suitable and might actually in the long term be causing damage. So sometimes, like old coatings or varnishes on wood, which were thought to be good at the time, might actually degrade over time and cause more damage than good. So sometimes we're just replacing old techniques as well. Skipped over there, unseen dirt or corrosion on the inside of the firearm. This is something I'm going to discuss with one of our upcoming examples that I've chosen. And then also, because we've got a modern collection as well, sometimes you have a piece of wood from 300 years ago and it's in perfect condition. And then unfortunately you get some rubber, which was made 20 years ago and it's completely degraded. So you can see that butt, that's the butt of an SA-80. So it's like a soft rubbery plastic and you get cracking over time. Unfortunately, plastics are quite new to relatively new to the museum world. So there hasn't really been enough research on how to stop this. The best answer people have given is to slow down that rate of reaction and freeze them. But we don't want our freezers full of SA-80s, because then if we want to use them for display or for research, we don't really want to be doing that, because you then think about wrapping them completely up as well so that moisture doesn't attack them. So these are condition problems we're looking for. So for example, what I then potentially have the power to do, let's say a curator wants that SA-80 for display, I can look at the state of that butt and say, no, you're not having this for display, unfortunately, because it will cause further decay to the object and there's no way of addressing it. Please look at our other SA-80s, because we've got others which might have better butts. Something like corrosion, however, I might look at it and say, it is corroded, you can have it, but I'm going to have to do 10 hours of work on it. And then the curator will say, okay, go ahead. So it's finding the condition, and what we have are our condition survey that we give to all objects. So this is generalized, not just for the firearms, it's for all objects we look at in the museum. So good is stable with use-related wear. So this might be a scratch, for example, that I mentioned. That scratch isn't going to deteriorate to a state that puts the rest of the object at risk. A fair condition might be loose surface dirt or minor reversible change, such as tarnishing or slightly misshapen areas. So for tarnishing, for example, or corrosion, it might be that corrosion's there, but it might get worse eventually. And it's not going to completely eat away the entire firearm, but it might make that area worse and cause a kind of chain reaction to that wider area. So it's fair, it can easily be treated, and it's fairly stable, but put in the wrong conditions, such as high humidity, might reactivate it. Poor is small isolated areas of minor structural instability, ingrained surface dirt or heavy soiling of organic materials, evidence of inactive surface corrosion, detached pieces of fragments, and distorted components. That poor generally means we're going to need sort of 10 plus hours to treat it. So it might be that there's something on a firearm stock which is loose, and if we was to put it on display, it risks coming off. So we might do something to repair that to stop it from breaking away. I've got some examples of some pores coming up, for example. But yeah, so pour it's going to need quite a bit of work, but it can go on a display eventually after we've done all this. And unacceptable, for example, that picture we saw where the firearm were in 3 pieces. Technically, you'd be able to display that, but in 3 pieces. If they asked us to put it together, we'd say that. If they wanted it as one single object, we'd have to say that's a poor object. It's actively deteriorated. It might be actively deteriorating. So, for example, active deterioration might be that there's wood insects actively in the firearm. So that's going to either need a lot of work, maybe over 50 hours of work, or it's just decided it's too fragile to put on display. An example of that unacceptable condition is that plastic stock, because that's only going to get worse. There's nothing we can do to treat it, because if we apply like an adhesive to it, that might make it worse in the long term as well, because we don't know what effect adhesives have on certain plastics over time. So here's some case studies of a couple of recent firearms we worked on. So I've covered. So to begin with, this was MG34. So unfortunately, we put this on display, and it was in near pristine condition, but we had a sort of software error with our environmental controls. So we have basically under every case air conditioning units, which either pump moisture into the case if it gets too dry, or it takes moisture out if it's getting too damp, to control that environment and keep it stable. Unfortunately, something happened, and we were able to spot that something was happening in the case. And when I opened it, it felt like a tropical jungle hit me. And I quickly put my monitor in, and it was at 70%. So it was very humid. Unfortunately, we don't know how long it was, but it did affect quite a few of the objects in there. So some of the textiles got mold on them. But to my tragedy, because I'd already treated this firearm for the gallery, and it was in very good condition, this MG34 got completely corroded and almost rotted away. It was essentially factory new, but if you look at the top right corner, you can see a lot of corrosions happen there. So much it's got rid of a lot of the blackened steel, and it's corroded through that. Essentially, with this type of so one thing I had to do for this, so it's one thing we do for our condition assessments is we question whether we should strip the firearm. So I'm quite lucky. I was able to go to Leeds, to the National Firearms Centre, and they gave me a firearm field strip training for a range of firearms. But with that, on top of that, in the museum, we have guides as well. But as you may have come across, there's always some American who loves to strip a firearm on YouTube as well. So there is lots of sources to be able to do this safely. And because I've had the training, the museum allows me to do so. So I did a field strip of this MG34, which is one of the more fun ones to do, actually. To do that, reason why is, like we said, there might be hidden damage within the firearm itself. The corrosion on the exterior was so bad, I needed to make sure stuff like the spring hadn't corroded as well. So I did a full field strip, and I found that nearly every component essentially had corroded to a large extent. What we do with corrosive objects which are active, and it was active corrosion as well, so it's almost like a ticking time bomb. The more we left it, the more it was active, probably going to take moisture from the environment and take some of the original steel from the surface and iron and corrode even more. So it was a quick decision to make. So for this one, because it was so heavily corroded, I had to actually use a power tool. I used a rotary drill with copper brushes to destroy that top layer of corrosion and start working it down. Once I got further down and the corrosion was so thick, I then had to start applying. We have this conservation acid that we use. It's essentially the same pH as lemon juice, so it's nothing too acidic. But what that does is soften up corrosion and sort of softens it up so that when you go back at it with a mechanical tool, so I went back at it with a scalpel, it's able to come away a lot quicker. So I had to give it a couple of acid rinses to sort of neutralize and remove the corrosion. Once I did that, I was then soaking the components. So we have deionized water, so it helps not to corrode it. So we soak it, and what that does is it allows the water starts pulling out corrosion, the chlorides that are attacking it. So it starts bringing out all these nasties, essentially. And then go back at it. So you do that, and then you go at it again with more acid and get rid of more of that corrosion because it was incredibly thick. And then rinse again, rinse and repeat, essentially, until I felt that the surface was stable, at a stable position, which tried to reflect the state it was in. So yeah, that's my before picture. It's after the issue, unfortunately. There was a very good before picture, then that was the medium picture, and then the bottom picture is my after picture from me treating that. I've used that because actually the sort of muzzle cover, the flash suppressor, that was the most heavily corroded part. But essentially, if reduce it down, and then we've applied a wax to it. Like we say, we shouldn't have to apply a wax to it because it does change the finish and might make it look shinier, for example. What I actually had to do, because it was so bad and the black and steel had reduced in so much, I actually then put a small sort of safe black pigment within the wax to give it a darker finish because it stood out quite a lot without that pigment. But like I say, we shouldn't have to wax it. Our cases should behave and look after themselves, but unfortunately this time it didn't, so we had to treat it. So yeah, largely as you can expect in our collection, corrosion is quite the prominent thing we have to deal with the firearms. Our next one then is what my colleague Philippa did. She was looking at textiles so we've got a SMLE here and a Winchester. So it might look like loose threads, but then what you have to start thinking about is transporting the object. So even if we're moving them and attaching them upstairs, those threads could catch, tear away and cause further damage. It might be that they get caught on something in a box, but then it might be that when they're on display, they're a bit more open and exposed to the environment or further damage. So we try and work with our textile conservator. She advises us. And what you can see in that before treatment and after treatment, she uses a semi-transparent polyester thread, which isn't too far away from, say, fishing wire. And we essentially pin them down and make it flat so they don't catch on anything. The one on the right, however, the Winchester, it was actually a starched sling, so you couldn't really stitch it as well because it was a bit crispier and firm. So we actually used a textile adhesive on that one to pin them down. We put a weight on it and let it set over time, and then all those loose threads padded there as well. So there are a couple of different examples. Sorry, I'm looking at the time. I hope you're enjoying it because I'm going a bit over, as I said. I probably said I would. But we'll look at some of the ways we display firearms quickly. So what we have to think about with our firearms. So here's two different displays. So the one on the left is probably ideal. So that's from our Civil War case. So that's a doglock musket. As you can see, we always have these nice displays which show the objects, whether it's the sword on the left or the firearms. What we have to do with that, we get mount makers who come and measure the objects, and then they work with our curator and our designer to put them on display. And then the conservation team say, yes, you can display it like that. But sometimes we might have to think of the structural stability of the objects. We might say, no, it's not suitable. So for example, that doglock musket on the left, the long one, that's on quite a flat surface. It's on two mounts. So one one at either end of the rifle, and you got to think about the weight distribution as well. But what mounts are designed to do, they're not there to clamp the object in place. You have to almost imagine them as two sort of cradling hands that hold them in position. Because you can imagine if you clamp them, actually putting the object on and changing its position, etc., that's potentially going to cause more damage. But then if you have a metal clamp, so I should explain, the clamps are either, if they need to be carrying more weight, they're made of steel and then sort of spray coated, or they're made of copper and then spray coated again. But actually where the mount touches the object, we then have a thin layer of that plastozoic foam that I mentioned earlier. So it's supporting it, but it's quite soft as well. So just think of it as a couple of soft pair of hands holding the object. If the curator asked us to position that dog lock in the way the SMLE is on the picture on the right, we'd have to say no, because that is such a steep angle for a very old piece of wood. We wouldn't trust that for long-term display. Whereas that SMLE there, it's quite sturdy. We had a look at it, we assessed it, and we determined that was suitable for that angle for display. So something like angles and weight distribution and where those forces are then acting upon the object are things we have to consider. You can see my MG34 down there. That's, again, because of the weight, we wouldn't put that on the back wall of the case, but that's on two steel rods on a plinth, so it's a lot more secure and taking that weight as well. So there are more traditional ways of displaying the objects. Like I said, the ones on the left are quite educational. You can see the firing mechanisms, etc. And then the ones on the right are a bit more contextual and design, with design taken into account. So the SMLE is meant to look like the soldiers holding it in front of it. Probably our favorite case in the museum, which people love, is our mass weapons case. This used to be a First and Second World War case, so it was a nice range of rifles, machine guns, SMGs, and different colors as well, because we started getting like green colored guns in there from the Second World War. But now it's just a First World War case, but it's very nice. But as you can see, we've got all those firearms at the top. Half of them are about cut out. I probably didn't take into account you're more interested in the stuff hanging above than the artillery piece below, to be honest. But what we've done there, security cables, and then they've got a plastic inert film that wrap around the cable. We had to test the weight of the firearms, test it against the load-bearing strength of the roof, because they're all hanging from the roof, and then think about whether they were suitable to hang. So again, if it was fractured wood and it wasn't suitable, we wouldn't hang it in this way. They're very strong. What you might be able to see there at the back, just I don't know if you can see my mouse there, but that's a sort of Mauser anti-tank gun. So they were able to take a lot of weight actually, but if we deemed them to be too fragile, we said, no, you can't hang it, unfortunately. And the curator found other examples to hang up. So yeah, that's a very good case. Other museums have started copying this hanging. If you've been to Airborne Assault, for example, they've got quite a cool hanging case now with all their sort of airborne firearms hanging from it. That's at Duxford. So then finally, I'll finish. Again, I've realized I've been talking an hour now. Hazards in our firearm collection. So radiation is one we have to be very careful of, sort of in both modern, but largely Second World War firearms. So we have a well-rod pistol there, and also we have a Japanese Taisho machine gun. Second World War, we loved putting radon on stuff, whether it's watches, compasses, vehicle dials, but we also put it on the well rod. That's because it's being used by SOE. And if they're using it in a dark environment, the radon basically glows and allows you to use both sights accurately. That's why the Japanese used it again as well. They used radon. Unfortunately, whereas if you have radon in a compass, the glass covers it. Radium paint on these firearms is just exposed. So if that starts deteriorating because it's in a poor condition, like paint can, if the humidity and temperature goes up and down, that's going to then start spreading radioactive material around our collection. So usually with these, we have to double bag them, label them as radioactive, And then we work with the MOD, who keeps a log of all our radioactive materials. With SA-80s, they've got Trilux sites, so it's a radioactive gas which is within the SUSAT site. So you'd have to smash the glass and then a gas to be released for that to be effective. But it comes under our radiation policy. So again, with the sites, we double bag them and put them away in a separate area so that not anyone can get to them. We do, however, display our radioactive material. So this is that well rod chosen for display for our little SOE exhibit within our Second World War section in the Europe gallery. Essentially, it was like any other firearm. Like I said, our most common problem is corrosion. You can see there's a corrosion patch up on the rear of the barrel / silencer, and there, and basically across the entire barrel / silencer, I'll say. That was just, again, about reducing it. However, you can see how close it is to that radioactive site. So you can see me in my PPE there, had to write a risk assessment, but we thought, it was worthwhile because it's a very interesting firearm. It covers a particular story of the Second World War, and the radium paint wasn't degrading enough that we had to say no. So we was able to get this on display, as you can see in that central picture. Like I say, before and after picture, they don't always look radically different, but that, like I said, that's kind of the point. We don't want to make it look radically different. We want to appreciate that it is an object that has been used in the past. One I'll cover, again, sorry if I'm going over time. Asbestos is something we come across a lot in the collection, but it can be quite mixed as well, and sometimes we can't confirm it. So firearms may contain asbestos components, usually on areas of firearms that have overheated during use. So largely it's for our rapid firing materials, largely the machine guns. So it might be something like a cocking handle or a barrel, a sleeve on the barrel. Yeah, it extends to machine gun mittens, for example, might have asbestos with them. But yeah, unfortunately, like with some of the First World War guns, it might be that there's asbestos within the water jacket, but we can't confirm it because then we'd either have to open the water jacket or we'd have to cut into it. So we kind of just have the policy of, if it might be there, let's say it is there, because we don't want to be too interventive and disrupt these things, because then if it does contain asbestos, we're exposing ourselves to it. Barrel cooling systems, gunslings as well. Like I said, we've had examples of Lewis gunslings containing asbestos in the fibers. And then, yeah, a barrel wrap of a Sten gun we've had as well. So it's not just machine guns, it can be some of the smaller. Largely, as you can imagine, the non-wooden firearms, where it's just metal and you're putting your hand to metal, that's when they might be creating sleeves, etc. If we have asbestos in a museum, we have to follow rules, we have to be compliant. If possible, we do have to get it checked, and then we either have to, which is, again, where it can be quite frustrating, we either have to get it removed, which, when considering about preserving the object, we're removing a component of that object. So in a way, we're altering it, which we don't like to do. But thankfully, we work with a company who are able at times to consolidate it. So they'll spray it with an adhesive. And although it's not great and it might give that area a bit of a shine and a tack to it, it's better than stripping all the material from that position. So we like that because it keeps the material intact. 3 quick mentions then, what we have to look for. As you can imagine, if we're getting new firearms into the collection, we have to assume loaded, as most, whether you're on a firing range or at an auction house, you're going to assume loaded until checked. So we're trained to how to check them. The tricky ones are the muzzle loaders, like the muskets. That's a bit of an extreme example there where an X-ray is taken place to check that there's a ball in there. The best way we do it is you use the ramrod, and if it doesn't go all the way down, there's probably a blockage in there, which might be a firearm, and then we get an expert to check that out. Like we said, XSOs and other chemicals, we don't want these getting on our hands. I did have some earlier, actually, yeah. So we always use nitrile gloves, kind of like what medics use. One, they provide better grip and they stop your hands getting horrible. Programs like Who Do You Think You Are where you see these nice white cotton gloves. We don't use them because, one, you can still get sweat through them and affect the object. Two, hazards might still transfer through those. And three, you can imagine like the fibers on the gloves might actually get caught on something like wood and cause it to splinter. So yeah, nitrile gloves are the way to use it. Don't use what they use on television, please. And then kinetic hazards. You might have stripped one of your firearms and a spring's flown at your face. It's something we have to deal with. Two reasons for this. Sometimes that happens in the construction. There is a spring you have to be wary of, which is why we get training and we read manuals when we're stripping. But one, it might be that some component within the firearms degraded to a point that it's not holding something in place as it should. And as you release that energy, it releases a spring or another piece of metal. But two, it might be someone's put something together incorrectly at the past because they've not had that training and education on how to reassemble a firearm. So there's some hazards we have to look for. Okay, sorry for going over time. I hope it's been insightful to how we look after our firearms at the museum. But yeah, if you have any questions,
well,
please.
Thank you very much indeed, Josh, for an informative talk. I hope none of our members started out with, well, they're just a bunch of old firearms, so they're easy to look after. Very interesting. I have quite a lot of contact with Royal Armouries and the Tower, as I'm sure you do, and they have all of these issues as well, of course.